Caroline Leavitt. I'm the co-founder of Mighty Blaze, the book initiative that was started to help authors and indie bookstores and readers during the pandemic. And I'm particularly excited today because we have one of my literary heroes, Peter Heller. And I want to say that way back a couple of years ago, a book called Dog Stars came through my door, and I was assigned to review it for San Francisco Chronicle. I went nuts out of it. I actually called it a ravishing doomsday novel, and people just went nuts for Peter, and they've continued to go nuts. He's the national best-selling author of The River, CELINE, The Painter, Dog Stars. The Painter was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and it won the Reading the West Book Award. Dog Stars has been published in 22 languages so far. It's just an amazing book, and it's actually one of the most perfect books to read now during the pandemic. He's also the author of Kook, What Surfing Taught Me About Love, Life, and Catching the Perfect Wave. And Peter told us shortly before this interview that he's recently been surfing. He's also the author of The Whale Warriors and Hell or High Water, Surviving Tibet's Spango River. And this new book, The Guide, it's an AARP Hot New Novel for Summer, a crime read novel you should read, an Alto Best Book of August, a Veranda Magazine Best Book of Summer, and a Lit Hub Most Anticipated Book of 2021. Of course, I can rave about it, but I want to read you other people's raves. Minneapolis Star-Tribune says, riveting, a chilling reminder of the dangers that may lie in wait for all of us. Crime Read says, Heller is building a reputation as a modern master of the wilderness thriller. It's true. It's absolutely true. And Booklist and a star review said, Heller presents another brilliantly paced, unnerving wilderness thriller paired with an absorbing depiction of a remote natural paradise. Okay, so The Guide is about Jack, a 25-year-old ranch hand who we've seen from a previous book, running from grief, going to work at an elite fishing lodge for the very wealthy. He's paired up with a celebrity singer, Allison, but things soon take a dark turn. So first I want to say, welcome, Peter. I'm so happy to have you here. And thank you for talking to us about this amazing book. I want to ask you, I was going to ask you anyway, but you asked me to ask you this question. Tell us about the origin story of The Guide.
So I always start a new novel with a first line. I came up as a poet, and I'm usually a little bit more interested in the music of the language than the story or the plot. And so I begin the way I would begin a poem, with just the sound of the language, a first line whose cadence and sound I love. And I sort of ride that line into the next and the next and follow the music of the language into the story. And so with this one, I wrote something, well, I have the book right here. I should probably get
yes.
first line right.
Yes, also bookshop.org is where you can buy all of Peter's books.
And this is the beautiful cover.
Gorgeous.
Kelly did at Knopf. First line was, they gave him a bunk in a cabin by the river, a wooded canyon, spruce and pine with rim rock up high and rock spurs that tumbled to the water. And so there was a porch, and I thought, great, I'm a sucker for a good porch. One of my favorite things in the world, especially if it looks over water or mountains. And then the man who dropped the pack was Jack from the previous book, The River. And I was so glad to see him. I left him at the end of the river for anybody who had read it, brokenhearted and sort of alone, going back to his family ranch in Western Colorado, young kid, only 22 years old, going back to work with a very taciturn old man whom he loves, but doesn't say much. And I worried about him. And so I was really glad to see him. And then apparently he was getting a job as a fly fishing guide at this lodge. And I thought, that's good. That'll be really good for you, a way to connect with the things that you love. Little did I know what would happen. But and then I was writing along, and something occurred to me. Every book I've done has had a different method. And The Dog Star is my first novel. I sat down at the coffee shop in my neighborhood, and I just said to myself, don't think, just listen.
Wow.
And this voice started speaking, and it was this guy, Hig. And it was for the next 7 months as if he was on the other side of a campfire, just telling me what had happened to him a few years before. And it was so thrilling. The painter, I sort of blocked loosely out, and then I would let it rip again. And for this one, I thought about something I'd heard a few years before. I was at a book festival outside of Palm Springs, and I don't love book festivals so much. They're very hectic, and so what I do to make them sort of palatable is I get up early and I get a cup of coffee and I work for a couple hours before the day starts. So I was up very early. I was at the breakfast place at like 6. And the only other writer there was Lee Child. And we sat at a table and had breakfast. We started talking about method. And I said, I like to start with the first line of, I was a poet, and I followed into the story. And he said, yeah, I do too. And I said, yeah, but, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't even know where I am. He said, me neither. I don't either. I was like, you got to be kidding me. And he said, no, I take everything I can think of and I throw it up against the wall. Dead bodies, car accidents, lurking, menacing figures. I throw everything I can think of up against the wall. I have no idea what's going to happen. And then for the second half, I just kind of mirror the first half, and I tie up all the loose threads, and whatever doesn't tie up is a red herring, and I'm good. And I just thought that was so fascinating, and I thought I'd just try it in this book. So Jack starts fishing. His first client is going to be this famous person named Allison Kay. He thinks maybe she's a famous singer. He figures he better start. He starts fishing with her, and immediately I had, a fisheye lens on the pedestrian bridge. It's not a spoiler. You'll get this in the first couple of pages. A post at the top of the fishing run that says, don't go past this post, you'll get shot. All sorts of stuff. I just piled it on, and I had no clue where it was going to go. But what really fascinated me was that you could sort of take all these random events and details and just, throw them out there, and that somehow they would generate a propulsive narrative. I just thought that was really interesting, and it did.
This is so totally fascinating. First of all, I was going to ask you this question later, but it's for now, actually, where you were talking about how grateful you were to be a writer, because it really is like living parallel lives. And when I read that, it felt like an electric shock to me, because I often feel like the world that I'm writing is just as real as this real world. And so when you talked about how Jack just came back to you, I was wondering, it seemed to me like you're saying that all your characters are just as real as you and I here. And maybe there's a kind of mystic or quantum physics kind of thing going on. Because when you talk about don't think, just listen, it was another electric shock, because I think for writers, sometimes we get in our own way. And I think if you listen, you actually can tap into something deeper, much the way that you do with nature. Would you say that's true?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, all my characters live in my heart, like, as real people, which is kind of weird.
It is weird, but it's.
150 years ago, we might have been in a padded cell, but we get to be on wonderful podcasts and, get to publish novels. But Jasper from the Dog Stars, the wonderful blue heeler, he lives in my heart like a dog that I had, and I grieve him sometimes.
Yep.
And I did worry about Jack like an old friend, and. So no, I think that's very, very true. And, when I'm writing and I'm so transported, I'll be in the coffee shop and I'll have like tears dripping off my chin onto the table because something just happened that surprised me. And I know people in the coffee shop are thinking, that poor son of a bitch, he must have, his dog must have died. He's going through a wicked divorce, But really what's happening is I'm more thrilled than I've ever been in my life.
It is. It's incredible. It's incredible. And when you reach that moment, some people call it the zone. I call it like writing's parallel universe. it's amazing. It's sort of the whole reason for doing it. So I want to take a turn and talk about your contact with nature, because it seems to me there are two kinds of nature books that are written. There are from the people who, they go out and they kill elephants and those are their trophies and they're into conquering nature. Your sense of nature is not about conquering at all. It's about communion. And again, I want to use that word spiritual again, because in reading the way you talk about, there was a scene in the guide where he's catching a fish and he's calming the fish down before he lets him go. That was just, I don't know, it was so real and it was so visceral that I felt changed reading it. So I wanted to know, did you always have this feeling about nature? And if not, where did it come from? And what do you wish that people knew about nature and how to live with it rather than trying to conquer it? What do you wish people knew about that? Sorry. I turned it off. Okay, it's gone. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know. I grew up in New York City, and I was always the kid, at the playground who was in the bushes, outside the playground, running around. And I spent all my summers up either in the Adirondacks or in the Long Island Sound.
I'm sorry, I did turn it off.
I love it when one of us screws up like that. It's good.
It's always screwed up. I don't know why it's doing that. Okay, go ahead.
But yeah, so I always felt most at home in nature somehow, more at home than with people. I always felt that I could connect to the best parts of myself when I was out in wild places, and maybe it is a spiritual thing. I have a creek outside of, I have a little place in a town called Paonia in western Colorado. It's the size of a postage stamp. And there's a little mountain creek 20 minutes from my house. And I have gone up there and fished that little creek in every season, every time of day, into the night, into when I couldn't see the fly anymore and the stars were out. I fished it when I was brokenhearted. I fished it when I was jubilant because my first book had been published. I fished it when my mother died. I fished it at every threshold moment of my life. It's a touchstone, the place I go back to. It's a wooded canyon, spruce and fir, and a little creek. And so, for me, that's as close as church as I get. And I just feel connected to, I sort of lose my, when I'm out there, I lose my sense of myself as a separate entity. And that is such a relief, to feel that connected, to forget my name, forget that I'm a human being and just be part of,
love that.
So that's what happens for me.
That's wonderful that you forget yourself and you become a separate entity. And in fact, it's sort of you're entering the lives of your characters. But I don't know, reading this book was so satisfying and so rejuvenating in a while, because right now, because of the pandemic and everything else, we need that kind of connection. So my next question is about, a lot of writers for, these past 18 months have been struggling with what are we going to write about the pandemic? How are we going to write about it in fiction? And you did it beautifully. And you actually, without giving anything away, COVID is part of your story world and part of your plot. Where did that come from?
Well, I wrote the book in the middle of, smack in the middle of the pandemic. And, for me, when you have this method that I have, where you just start with the first line, you sort of follow the language,
right.
You don't know where it's going. What happens for me is that within a few pages or a chapter, I always end up bumping into what's really concerns me, what's really on my heart. And I sort of have faith that the language will take me to that place. And so in the middle of COVID, when I was so worried about my sisters in New York City and my older father in New Orleans and I have a lot of older friends, that had to inform the novel, just the way the other things that I'm thinking about all the time and that hurt my feelings, like climate change, like mass extinction. Those things are going to inform the work. So I think in some ways artists, people say their role is to grapple maybe with issues that are hard for all of us to deal with. And I'm not sure that artists, have a role, but I think naturally as creative people, we tend to drift towards those big issues that are really tough. And so,
well, it was a perfect kind of plot device. I also wanted to talk about it, some other thing that's very much in the zeitgeist here, which is how polarized we are now between the wealthy and the not so wealthy. The people at this fishing lodge are really wealthy, and they're going for spa treatments, and other things are going on there too. And also then we have Jack and all these people filtering through him. And I think the connection between the two groups are Allison, who is a famous singer, and yet she's revealed as a very real person. So what I loved about that was that it didn't really seem that you were creating something that was us against them, regular people against very wealthy people. It seems like you were really trying to get very well-rounded characters. Can you talk about that, about the discrepancy in the world between the rich and the poor, and how it's growing larger, and how you attempted to talk about it in this particular novel?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's another issue that is really, and I think about a lot, and that I feel as I go through my life, is the hollowing out of the middle class.
Yeah.
This sense that, there's the rich who get to go off and go fly fishing and have spa treatments, and then there's everyone else, sort of working fast food and cleaning their rooms. And it wasn't that way when I grew up. I mean, when I grew up, there was, I'm old enough to remember a healthy middle class when, my neighbors had maybe a cabin in the country. They might have had a little boat. They went out and pursued things that they loved to do because they had the means, and they were working people. And nowadays, I feel like that's less and less true. It's the super wealthy that get to do that, and all the rest, are in service to them. And it takes the fun out of everything, and it sets up a cruel. I mean, I think it makes a cruel vibe that runs through the entire culture.
Yeah,
and, it's horrible.
Exactly. It is cruel. It is cruel, which is sort of and kind of meaningless also. But I really appreciated the way you wrote about it. I want to talk about the way you built up tension in this book, which is very different from a lot of things. There's no like shoot 'em ups or car chases or people. Instead, what you do is really subtle, and that makes it more and more ominous. There are things like, there was a scene where somebody just sees a boot, and that freaked me out far more than if you saw a man standing there with a hammer or something. Or you see somebody in like this white gown, looks like a hospital gown, and you don't know anything more about it. And as you kept going through the novel, those incidences ramp up and up and up. So what I wanted to know was this planned, or again, it wasn't?
No, all that
Oh,
stuff. I mean, I just want to have fun. So, as I'm writing these novels, I just want to have as much fun as the reader, I came up not only as a poet, but as a kayaker. And I spent half my life running rivers. And what I loved about running rivers was, and if you think about it, a river is sort of like, it's like a narrative. You start, you put on this narrative current, and you follow it into territory that you've never, been in before. And what I loved about river running is that you could come around a bend of a river that hadn't been described, and you never knew it was there. It could be a waterfall or a cougar drinking or a flight of swallows, or if you were in the wrong place, it could be like 5 people with bows and arrows or rifles that didn't want to see you there. I love that. I love the sense of discovery, and I wanted that experience when I was writing. I didn't want to outline. I read John Gardner's book about writing novels, and this idea of making an outline and then just filling in the details with smaller and smaller numerals and letters. And I thought, gee, if I was going to do that, I could have just been a lawyer, had a more, dependable income, right? But but I like going along and just discovering stuff and being as thrilled as the reader. And so this thing that Lee Child said particularly appealed to me, just, you know, piling on intriguing details and events and not really knowing where they were going to lead and just sort of trusting that it was going to work out. And what I love about that mostly is what it suggests about the work that we do in our unconscious. I mean, think about it. If you're going to throw up a pile of what seems random details and it's all going to make a whole story by the end, without, you know, a ton of revision, you must be doing a lot of work in your sleep or when you're staring out the window.
Yeah.
Which is really cool.
Which is totally cool. It goes back to what you were saying at first, where like, just listen, you know, just listen. Don't stress, because I know a lot of writers, myself included, tend to get very stressed when the writing is not going well. And you think, oh my God, I should have just gone to dental school. But what you should do actually is what you said. Just step back, listen, or think about it before you go to sleep. Do you ever do that? Like, you know, think about a plot issue and then trust that you're going to solve it in your sleep?
Yeah, sure. You know, in the middle of Dog Stars, I wrote Dog Stars in kind of a white heat. You know, it took 7 months. I write 1,000 words a day every day when I'm writing a novel, 7 days a week. I never write less, and I go just past 1,000 words until I'm in the middle of a scene that's exciting.
Okay.
That way I'm stopping in the middle every day. I don't let myself run. I mean, if I'm excited about a scene, you know, I don't let myself just run, because what happens if you write that 3,000 words and go, whew, and go on with the rest of your day, you always come back to a transition, white space, double returning, and you might as well start the book every day, right? So you know, I like to stop in the middle, and it generates a lot of momentum. I jump out of bed and I can't wait to get started again. This idea of, you know, letting it rip, I mean, sometimes, so in the Dog Stars, I stopped in the middle of the book and I went on a Grand Canyon trip. I kayaked to Grand Canyon for 21 days.
Wow.
And while I was doing it, I know I was thinking of it. Hig was about to leave the airport. I was sort of thinking, you know, where's he going to go and what's he going to find? And, you know, some stuff occurred to me. And, you know, the interesting thing is that when I got back to the coffee shop after 3 weeks, none of the stuff I had dreamed up on the trip occurred. You know, that's not what happened. But I think for me, there's always a mix of authorial control and letting go. I was writing the second book, The Painter, after this sort of fugue state with the Dog Stars. I thought, you know, I don't want to have second novel syndrome. I've heard about, you know, when the first book comes out and it makes a splash or gets any kind of response, it can create a lot of pressure. I didn't want that. I started writing on the next novel. I thought I had about 9 months until the Dog Stars was actually out. And I started writing, and I started with the first line like I always do, and I was listening. But I started thinking about it. I started thinking, Jim Stegner, the painter, he's got this commission in Santa Fe. When should he go? Should the brother of the guy he kills follow him there, you know, bent on vengeance? And then I started thinking, I'm thinking about it. This can't be good, you know, because I didn't really think about the last one. And so I was in the middle of this struggle. I was in Paonia, Colorado, where the book takes place. And I was in the tiny little coffee shop, the real coffee shop where Jim Stegner meets his model that becomes his friend. And it's tiny. It's a tiny coffee shop. And you're going to talk to anyone who's in there. And guess who was in there? Paolo Bacigalupi, the great science fiction writer. He's written, you know,
wow,
books that have won Hugo Awards, Andromeda Awards, big bestsellers. We got to talking, and I was telling him about my struggle. And he's a lot younger than me, but he picked up his coffee cup and he said, "Sit down, son. I want to tell you a story." And he said, you know, I wrote one short story that I completely controlled every second. I plotted every bit of it, designed the characters to interact a certain way. And I sent it in, it won a big award, and I love it. Second story, I kind of just let it rip, sort of that fugue state thing. I kind of woke up, it was done. I sent it in, it won a big award, and I love it. And now I hold them both up and I look at them both and I love them both and I can't tell the difference. And he leaned forward and he said, your job is just to make sure it doesn't suck. And when he said that, the whole creative burden just sort of lifted off my shoulders, because I thought that is something I can probably handle. What the thing that was so marvelous was every book can have a different method. Don't sweat it. And it can have a mix. You can let it rip. You can, you have revision to rely on. You can tighten up the slow spaces, move stuff around, just make sure it's not awful.
That's incredible that you said that, because actually my next question that you just answered was, writers always, at least the writers I know, we always sit around and talk about, well, did you learn any lessons from the book you just finished that you can apply to the next one? And none of us ever has, because it's always a new project. But what you just said releases a whole lot of the tension there, that you can just sit there and listen and do it, and it doesn't have to be one particular way. That's very freeing. That's very, very freeing. I love that you have said in an interview that you don't heed the market, you don't heed the critics, but you ask God as you see God, and I love that phrase, in nature, and the answer somehow comes. That's just beautiful and moving.
Well, that was something. I mean, that wasn't my idea. I went to the Iowa Writers Workshop late. I was like 32, and I took poetry and fiction. I did both workshops, and I was lucky enough to have Jory Graham as a teacher in poetry. She's a magnificent Pulitzer Prize winning poet and a wonderful teacher. And we were talking one day in a seminar, and she said, I think every poem begins with a question, and the poem is the answer, and probably every work of art. And she said, don't ask the question of me, your teacher, or the critics, or your reader. Ask it of God. Why not aim high? And I just love that. I thought about that ever since. And God for me is what I feel out in the woods. So.
I love that. Okay, I have one last question, and then we're ready for questions from the audience. Without giving anything away, I want to talk about the last chapter. I don't want to say whose voice the chapter is in, but except that it's not Jack's voice. And I wanted to know, was there a reason other than it just felt right to you to end the book with somebody else's voice and perceptions other than Jack? Because I thought it was such an interesting piece of writing, and I wanted to know why.
Well, like as I said, I don't really plan anything. I just follow my nose, so it's kind of hard to answer. But I think there's a lot of rules that people are taught, in schools and stuff about writing, and I think most of them aren't. I don't think they're all that helpful. Maybe they're helpful when you're just beginning. And it's sort of like, when you're a painter, you have to learn the proportions of the body, learn to draw before, mess them all up, like Picasso did. but for me, it's about following my nose. And, I know that people, have said, you really can't switch point of views, suddenly if you've been, trundling along in one. Unless, that's obviously part of the plan of the book. You might not want to switch voices, right at the end of a book. And I kind of think, well,
why not?
You can do that if you want to obey the rules, but nobody produced anything great by following all the rules. we just over here, we just kind of let it rip. Follow our nose.
You have a question from Sylvia. Thank you, Sylvia. Having grown up in New York, where was your first outside city nature experience that touched your soul? I want to add, was it Central Park?
I used to run around. I grew up above the piers in Brooklyn. I used to run around on the piers, above the river. And I just love the river, the East River. It's not really a river. It's it connects the inner New York Harbor to Long Island Sound, but it sort of feels like a river. I just loved it down there. And Central Park was cool. I had cousins in Vermont, and I would go there every weekend that I could, even as a little guy. And I begged my parents when I was 15 to send me away to school up there in Putney, Vermont. And man, my first week there, I went on a survival solo. I was 15 with no food, no sleeping bag, no tent.
Wow.
For a week. I had weighed 129 pounds when I started because I was just a skinny little kid, and I lost like 13 in a week. But I loved it. I just love being that raw, and that close to everything, probably close to dying too.
Make life more real if you're close to dying. So when did you always know you were going to be a writer?
Yeah, man. My dad read to me every night when I was a little kid, and when I was 6, he had me reading E.E. Cummings when I was 6. He was reading it to me, and I didn't understand the poems, thank God. It was kind of body. Now I know, but I love the music and the language, the sound of them, and I kind of wanted to do that ever since I was 6.
We have another audience question. Camus believes that solitude is the luxury of the rich, but nature is free to everyone. Do you think your narratives are a call to action for your readers to rediscover nature? Good question.
Definitely. It disturbs me that when I go to hang out with my nieces, they don't look up too much from their devices. Really bothers me.
Yeah.
So I'm always really excited when young readers love these books, because I know that it will spur them to get out on the trail or get out on a river.
It truly changes you. I mean, it truly. I lived in New York City for so long, and I always thought, oh, the only tree I see is in Central Park. And a friend of mine had a country house in the Poconos, and we went, and she took us on a walk through the forest. It was transformative, and you can't describe it to somebody. You have to be in that moment and realize. It makes you really realize that we're all connected, and that includes the very living earth.
Yeah, and it's the only way we're going to save it too. I mean, you have to have people that care, and so people have to get out. Yeah.
Okay, so here's an audience question. Your writing style is improv and free form. What a good question. How does this sync with the editorial process with your publisher?
Oh, it's a wonderful question. So
it's a great
I wrote Dog Stars. I sent it into my agent, and he's never used an exclamation point. He doesn't believe in it, but he used about 6. After he read, he said, "Wow!" and he sent it to Jenny Jackson at Knopf, and he sold it in a matter of days. And she edited it, and the editing process consisted of trimming about 2 pages in aggregate and changing some of the apocalyptic language, some of the words, like all the intruders were called visitors with a capital V. She got rid of those. Thank goodness. The genre language. That was it. And I thought to myself, wow, these editors in New York, they're awesome. They're really good. They don't do anything to my work.
You're very lucky.
The painter, my agent made me rewrite it twice, and Jenny made me rewrite it like 3 times. And I'm really fast, so all of that took just a few weeks. But
aren't you glad when they do, though?
Yeah. Oh man,
I love rewriting.
I mean, I have an agent who's old school and who actually line edits, and then I have this editor, and I also have a few first readers here in Denver. My wife is one of my first readers. I read her chunks aloud, and I'll see her at the end of the couch, and she's nodding off.
Oh
no! She'll say, "Too much fishing." And then I cut it in half, and it's right. But I always feel so grateful for that input. It's almost like having 3 literary minds instead of 1. It's great.
Yeah, and again, it's more of what you were talking about before, with this sense of connection with everybody and with everything in the world per se. I wanted to ask you about your writing style with your nonfiction books, because do you not? I kind of think that you probably do have to plan those.
No, that's a whole different process. That's journalism, and then you're what happens there is you're responsible to people, who are living their lives, and I like to write about people who are doing who are really committed to what they're doing, and so I feel very responsible, especially people who are working in the environment, and I feel very responsible to get it right. And so there's a lot of research that goes in. There's a lot of planning. There's a lot of outlining for those books, for sure.
What's obsessing you now, and why?
I have been obsessed by this sense that I've had, for the last 3 decades, that the ecosphere is unraveling and that we are in the middle of the 6th great mass extinction, and that, thousands of species, every week, probably, we don't know, because so much we haven't discovered, is going into the dark because of us. And it really, really, really is heavy on my heart. I mean, I think it's more than a crime. I think it's a sin. And,
I would agree with that. I think it's definitely a sin too, because we have this gorgeous planet and we destroyed it, and we're still destroying it. And it's a very scary thing. A lot of scientists say it's too late.
yeah, I mean, that's what I think about mostly. And I remember I was lucky enough to have another teacher in fiction at the Iowa Writers Workshop, Marilyn Robinson, and what a great writer. And we became friends, and I was once in her backyard having iced tea, and I asked her what she thought evil was, and she didn't hesitate. She said, impediment to being. And
That's brilliant.
I've thought about that a lot ever since, and I think that's what we are doing as a species, is that evil thing.
Yeah. Oh, I almost forgot. There's this line through your book that I loved. I wrote it down, and I think it's something like, "What's better than this? What's better than this?" Where there are moments where Jack will ask that when he's just thinking, "I'm on the river, it's great. What's better than this?" And then there are moments where he almost uses it to remind himself, when things are not so good, that things can be better. Is that a phrase that you yourself use for yourself? I love it. I love it. I love that whole idea of reminding yourself that what's better than this?
What could be better than this?
What could be better? Right. Sorry.
Yeah, I say it a lot.
I'm going to start saying it. I'm going to start saying
Gratitude.
This is just great. Do we have any more audience questions? Okay, while we're waiting for, we probably have time for one last audience question. And while we're waiting for that, I want to ask you, what didn't I ask you that I should be ashamed that I forgot to ask you?
I think you covered everything. That's brilliant.
Okay. Well, tips for rewrites when there's less clean progress. Do you have any? Thank you for the question, Margaret.
Well, I think the best tip is to have a good first readers, because all of us, even I've written hundreds and hundreds of stories, with magazine stories, short stories that I have written and thrown in a drawer, and still in my own work, there gets to be a point where I can't see the forest for the trees. And so it's very hard to rewrite unless you know what to do. And so I really, really rely on my first readers. And so it's great to find someone you trust, to look over your work and say, even if it's just that this has seemed to lose energy here, or slow here, or this didn't feel real, this dialogue doesn't feel authentic somehow. It's super helpful.
And do you have a favorite independent bookstore that you'd like to give a shout out to?
I have 2 in my neighborhood. I have the Tattered Cover downtown in Denver, which is where I've launched every book. And it's just a wonderful literary home and watering hole for me. And then there's up closer to my house is a bookstore called the Book Bar, which I also adore, which is doing a lot of innovative things with the community and getting books out into the community in underserved areas and stuff. And so both great watering holes to have nearby.
Sylvia has another question. Thank you, Sylvia. What are you reading these days? And she apologizes if it was asked because her internet is sketchy today.
Right. I've been reading lots and lots of Spanish language writers. So
really,
everything I can get my hands on by Ira, the Argentinian, who's just crazy. The speaker of the narrator in a novel will switch genders, in the middle of the book, and
wow,
the rabbits will start flying, and I just love how brave and risk-taking the work is. I love Mutis, the Colombian, who was a contemporary of Garcia Marquez. I like Villa Matas from Barcelona. Brilliant writer. So I've been doing a lot. I just read a wonderful book called Don Casmurro, which was written in 1899 by a Brazilian writer, Macano, and just loved it. Thought it was very avant-garde, even though I was 120 years old. So that's what I'm doing these days.
Well, I want to thank everyone for showing up to listen to Peter, and I want to thank you so much, Peter. It's just an honor for me to meet you in person. You really have been my literary hero. I encourage everybody to please go to bookshop.org or your favorite indie bookstore and order the guide, which is just a wonderful book, or any of Peter's other books. And thank you so much, Peter. And we'll see all of you at the Blaze next time. Thanks. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you.